The sitcom Seinfeld gets a lot of credit for reinventing the entire genre of the television sitcom. It was actually not the first of what we might want to call the new model of sitcom that started in the late 1980s. And these are the sitcoms that came fast and furious for a period of years from the late 80s to the early 90s, where they would take a stand-up comedian and they would build a loosely concepted show around that person's stand-up persona. So we think about Seinfeld and we think about Home Improvement and Roseanne and Grace Under Fire. But there was, in fact, an earlier even than Seinfeld, there was one called Chicken Soup, which was widely panned and did not get, it not only did not get renewed, it got canceled partway through its season order and didn't even air the entirety of its episodes. So that set Seinfeld already in a rough position. Seinfeld was set up for failure. Chicken Soup had done very, very poorly. Seinfeld premiered on the 5th of July in the middle of the summer, where nobody was looking for new shows. And it is really a miracle of television production that it survived to become the groundbreaking sitcom that it did. And it's groundbreaking in part because Jews had effectively disappeared from the television airways between 1949 and 1989. So on a period of 40 years, there were 7 explicitly Jewish protagonists across all of primetime network television. Then between 1989 and 1992, so now in a period of 3 years, there were 8 explicitly Jewish protagonists in network television. And Seinfeld is really given the credit for being the show that launched this renaissance of Jewish protagonists on TV and brought Jewish characters back into the forefront. Jewish characters had actually been relatively common in the early days of television. And then there was a pullback as the Jewish network executives became concerned that too many Jewish characters on TV were going to cause kind of bounce back anti-Semitism. This is something that television scholar Vincent Brooke calls surplus visibility. It's when a minority group kind of self-censors because they think that if they're too visible, people are going to respond negatively to that. So even though all of the networks, all of the TV networks were owned by Jews, they began to self-censor and they began to take Jewish characters off the air. So we have this 40-year desert where there were really very, very few Jewish protagonists on the air. So one of the things that changed, one of the major things that changed is in the late 1980s, that's when the networks all got sold from these private families that had owned them since their inception to corporations. And the corporations had none of the same fears of surplus visibility. What corporations want is what makes money. So with Seinfeld, what we got were the creators, who are Jerry Seinfeld and Larry David and Larry Charles, essentially creating a show in their own image. And so all of these comedians who identified kind of as New York Jews, they were really Los Angeles Jews now. They were living in LA. So when we think about what Seinfeld did in terms of changing the sitcom landscape and how it became a watershed moment for Jewish comedy and for Jews in sitcoms, we can kind of break it down into 3 phases. And this, again, is media scholar Vincent Brooke identifies these 3 different phases of Jewish sitcoms. And so he talks about that initial 1989 to 1992 moment that I mentioned, where we suddenly get 8 Jewish protagonists on primetime television in a 3-year period. And so that included Seinfeld. That also included Richard Lewis's Anything But Love. And it included the unfortunately failed Chicken Soup. The second phase then, which goes from 1992 to 1996, is shows that were suddenly trying to capitalize on Seinfeld's popularity. Things that wanted to ride the Seinfeld coattails. So this would include Paul Reiser's Mad About You. This included The Nanny. This included Dr. Katz, Professional Therapist. Some people even include Friends in this category. So that is the wave of things that were attempting to be Seinfeld, and things that were trying to figure out what made Seinfeld so successful and cookie cutter reproduce other versions of it. The third phase then goes from 1997 to 2002. And these are things that are not necessarily trying to copy Seinfeld anymore. They are the things that Seinfeld has made possible. So this is where we get Dharma and Greg, or Will and Grace, and most importantly, Curb Your Enthusiasm. Curb Your Enthusiasm, in a sense, couldn't exist if Seinfeld didn't exist. But it's also different than Seinfeld in some very important ways. Curb Your Enthusiasm is Larry David's sort of loosely autobiographical show about himself, or at least about a character named Larry David, who lives in Los Angeles and is fabulously wealthy because he created Seinfeld. But the Larry David on the TV show is also not precisely real life Larry David. Real life Larry David has often said that the TV version of himself is happier and works less than real life Larry David. But Curb Your Enthusiasm, although it exists because Seinfeld existed first, it also exists in an extremely different manner, in part because it is an HBO series. And there is a world of difference between what Larry David and Larry Charles and Jerry Seinfeld were able to put on network television in the early 1990s, and what Larry David is allowed to put on what we call premium cable, or subscription-based cable in the 21st century. He can be much more vulgar, he can be much more sexual, he can be much more offensive in a lot of ways. And so although there is a kind of direct line from Seinfeld to Curb Your Enthusiasm, Curb Your Enthusiasm almost owns it, or owes its existence more to changing patterns in TV viewership and network structures. And we wouldn't have Curb Your Enthusiasm if we didn't have Seinfeld, but we also wouldn't have Curb Your Enthusiasm if we didn't have the move away from the four major networks that bounded Seinfeld and bounded so many of those other sitcoms into certain boxes that Curb Your Enthusiasm is able to transcend.